All right. We're going to talk about necessary and sufficient assumption questions. Before we do so, though, I want to do something a little bit differently this time and talk about necessary and sufficient conditions, because when we start talking about necessary and sufficient assumptions, people will occasionally start talking about necessary and sufficient conditions. And I'm like, okay, they're different things. They're totally different things, in fact. So to avoid confusion, maybe if we talk about them together, we can stop equating them. Okay? So there are some similarities, which is why I think it's confusing, but let's talk about necessary and sufficient conditions first. Does anyone know what they are and what I mean by that? Yes?
So it's like each one is a half of the if-then statement.
Each one is a half of the if-then statement. That is true.
Now, which is which? I think necessary is the second half and sufficient is the first half.
You are correct.
If sufficient, then necessary.
That's exactly right. So you have an if-then statement. You know, if I go golfing, then I will hate myself, right? So that's an if clause and that's a then clause. And this is called the sufficient condition, and this is called the necessary condition. Sound good? And we do need to know those terms because on the LSAT, you will see these terms in flaw questions. Have you guys seen that question, that answer choice? It says, oh, the argument confuses a necessary condition for wanting fame with a sufficient condition for wanting fame, or something like that. Or confuses a sufficient condition for hating oneself with a necessary condition for hating oneself, right? Something like that. Okay, so in any case, this is the sufficient condition, this is the necessary condition. I think to help us remember these names, it might help to just take a half second here and talk about why this is called sufficient, this is called necessary. Anyone have a guess why the if clause is called the sufficient condition? Let's see if any, yes?
So the necessary clause necessarily happens should the if clause occur.
That's exactly right. Yes, it's called the necessary condition because it necessarily will happen. There's nothing that can prevent it from happening once that happens. Yes, and the sufficient condition?
It's sufficient. It's enough to make that thing happen. As long as that happens, that other thing will happen.
Yes.
And so it's sufficient.
To make this happen, do you need to know anything else? No. That's why it's called sufficient. So if I call you up and I say, hey, I'm golfing, and then the line cuts out, right? You'd be like, oh, that's too bad. He's gonna hate himself, right? But you don't need any other information. You don't need to follow up and be like, how you feeling? You know, what's your mental state? You just be like, hey, based on this if-then statement, you're hating yourself. Okay, good? So that's a necessary and sufficient condition. This is an if-then statement. And by the way, if-then statements, this is just another point of confusion, they come together as a package. Okay, I can't walk in here and say, if I go golfing, all right, let's start talking about necessary and sufficient assumption questions. Right? You'd be like, if you go golfing, what, right? Or I can't say, then it's going to rain tomorrow. Just say it in, like, just throw it out there. Like, okay, then, like, you need the other piece, right? So this is one thing. And because it's one thing, that entire thing is going to be a premise, or that entire thing is going to be a conclusion, or that entire thing is going to be an assumption. Right? Sometimes people say, oh, well, that's the premise and that's the conclusion. Nope. The entire thing is one entity. Okay, cool. Now, what are necessary and sufficient assumptions? First of all, let's talk about assumptions. What are assumptions? Yes.
Unstated premises.
They are unstated premises, and by that, what do you mean?
They're not going to appear in the actual statement, but but they are necessarily true.
They are not going to appear in the actual statement. What do you mean by that?
I mean, the words are not like written in the statement.
Okay, yeah. So I'm cool with the unstated part. Yeah. But what do you, in the statement? What do you mean by
the main paragraph.
Okay, in the paragraph, and specifically, that paragraph is going to be a paragraph of what? Is it going to be a set of facts? Or is it going to be an argument?
It would be an argument.
It would be an argument, right? In a set of facts, you don't have assumptions, you just have facts. Facts may be left out, but we have no idea what they are. You can only have assumptions in an argument. So an argument is going to have a couple premises, 2, 3, 4, who knows, maybe just one, and then a conclusion. And an assumption is a premise that was left out, right? It should be here, but it's not there. You guys cool with that? So it's a missing piece in the argument. So if an argument is making an assumption, is the argument valid or invalid?
It's invalid.
So for simplicity, we're going to say that all arguments that have an assumption are invalid. Because for an argument to be valid, what is true about the premises?
They need to logically flow towards the conclusion.
They need to logically prove the conclusion, which means the premises, now this is where things get confusing, because we're using the same terminology, but the premises need to be sufficient, right? So I'm not talking about a sufficient condition, I'm saying the premises are enough. We have enough premises to prove this conclusion. If you don't have enough premises, if you're making assumptions, if you're leaving pieces out, then the argument's invalid because, yeah, the evidence may get us almost all the way there, but to make it go all the way, we have to start assuming things. We have to start adding things to the argument, right? Now, sometimes on the LSAT, certain premises may be left out, and so the argument is making an assumption, but we would still consider the argument valid because the assumption that's being made is so small that it would be insanely absurd to challenge it. Remember, this was at the very beginning of class, and we were debating, what was it, like wobbly?
Wobbly and unstable.
Yeah, we're like, wait, if something's unstable, does that mean, if it's wobbly, does that mean it's unstable? And it's like, well, we don't know for sure, so that is an assumption, but some assumptions are so small, so reasonable, that even though it's left out of the argument, the LSAT's going to treat that as essentially a valid argument, right? I think I gave the other example that time of, remember Wednesday, Thursday? Something like, today's Wednesday, Joe's getting fired tomorrow, therefore Joe's getting fired on Thursday. And most of us say, okay, that's a valid argument. It's assuming that Thursday comes after Wednesday, but who's really going to argue with you on that, right? Like if you raise that point, you run for president someday and you're like in a town hall meeting and you're like, oh, well, hey, how do we know Thursday comes after Wednesday? Everybody's going to be like, okay. Right? Like, it's a technical point you could make, but it's such a reasonable assumption that we're not really going to worry about it. In any case, the point here is that assumptions are missing pieces, and on the test, they can ask you for necessary assumptions, and they can ask you for sufficient assumptions. And depending on what they're asking you for, that's going to dictate which answer is correct. It's not uncommon for them to ask you for a necessary assumption, give you a necessary assumption in one of the 5 answer choices, and then give you a sufficient assumption in one of the other 5 answer choices. And people pick the sufficient assumption like, oh yeah, that's the answer, and then it's like, no, that's wrong. And they're like, what? It's because they're mixing up what they're looking for. Right? They don't know which one they're looking for. So let's talk about this one first. Any guess what a necessary assumption is? Something that must be true. Okay, so it's a premise that the author left out, right? That's the definition of an assumption. But it's also a premise that the author absolutely needs. In other words, if this premise turned out to be false, if this premise turned out to not be true, the argument would fall apart, right? Now, the thing about necessary assumptions is when people hear the phrase necessary assumption, they think that they need something strong because the word itself, necessary, sounds strong. It turns out that necessary assumptions are often very weak because what must be true tends to be a weak claim, right? Like, what do you need to get into law school? You need an LSAT score, right? Now, does the fact that you have an LSAT score get you into law school? No. So How about this? You need an LSAT account. Yeah, necessary, right? So absolutely essential. If you don't have that, you can't apply through the Credential Assembly Service, which I think all law schools require at this point, except for the bogus ones you don't want to apply to anyway. So assuming that they do, right? You need that. So if you don't have it, you're not going to law school. But does that mean that once you get it, you're good to go? Right? No. So necessary assumptions tend to be the bare minimum. Without them, the argument fails. But that doesn't mean that if you have them, you're now good to go. Right? Like, there's a whole bunch of necessary assumptions, actually, for going to law school. You have to survive until August of, 2020 or whenever you're planning to go. But a whole bunch of other people in this world are going to survive until August 2020, but not go to law school, right? Okay, sufficient assumptions, on the other hand, and guess what they are? Guarantee what?
The conclusion.
They're going to guarantee the conclusion. So any guess, is a sufficient assumption likely to be strongly or weakly worded? Strong. And because it doesn't have to be necessary, because it's not necessary, or it may not be necessary, the correct answer can be complete overkill. Like, this is a crazy sufficient assumption, but this would be correct in every sufficient assumption question on the planet. If the answer choice said, all conclusions are true. Right? Like, you're like, huh? Well, if all conclusions are true, if we assume that, that would make my conclusion true, and then the argument would be valid. Right? So, totally crazy, but the point is that sufficient assumptions are now going to guarantee that this is true. All right. So, one thing about this, the correct answer does not, and usually does not, prove the conclusion. The correct answer here will always prove the conclusion. In a necessary assumption question, let's say that the original argument made, for the sake of simplicity, let's do this. Let's say your argument had a premise, that then had an intermediate conclusion, and then the intermediate conclusion went on to support the main conclusion. Sound good? And there was a jump in reasoning going from here to here, and there was a jump in reasoning going from here to the main conclusion. Sound good? So this argument has two flaws. Flaw number 1 is right here, and flaw number 2 is right here. And both of these flaws are essentially assumptions. By jumping from here to here, this argument is making an assumption. So for example, if I say, hey, I made a lot of money today, yay, therefore I will be happy. That's not necessarily true, right? Think about people have money or make money and they're not happy, right? And it's like, oh, because I'm happy, I'm going to now be generous. Well, that's not necessarily true either, right? So my point is that I'm making a jump from here to here. I'm assuming that people who make money are going to be happy. And I'm assuming that people who are happy are going to be generous. Sound good? Now, a necessary assumption question can do one of two things. One, it could point out this assumption right here. It could say, hey, this argument is assuming that at least some people who make money become happy, or are happy because of that, right? It's assuming that that is true for at least some people. Now, if we make that assumption, does that fix this argument? No, because we still have this other flaw, right? So a necessary assumption is often incomplete because it may only fix one of 2 or 3 problems, right? There's another thing about necessary assumptions, though, is that, and actually I just did it accidentally, I didn't mean to do it already, but it may not even entirely fix that problem, right? This argument said, hey, Joe made money today, therefore Joe is going to be happy. So I'm assuming that if you make money, you're going to be happy, right? So the assumption is if money, then happy, but and if I say that, if I say, hey, money leads to happiness, if I say that, then I've fixed that problem. I've fixed that jump in the reasoning. But the correct answer may not actually say that. It may just say, sometimes, and that's what I said earlier, sometimes when you make money, you become happy. Now notice, would this fix this flaw right here? Why not?
Because Joe could still be among the other people.
Yeah, Joe could still be among the other people who makes money and is not happy, right? So, like, this right here is, yes, it's a necessary assumption, because if you don't assume that sometimes people who make money become happy, then they never do. And then we're never going to get from here to here, and now this argument starts to fall apart, right? So we need to assume this, but just because we've assumed it doesn't mean we're now good to go with this assumption or with this gap, right? So a necessary assumption can be a necessary assumption because it fills in one of the gaps, or because it just starts to fill in one of the gaps. It's like the bare minimum. Yes, I need this, even if it's not nearly enough, right? What do you need to get across the desert? Well, you need some water. You need an ounce of water? Yes, you need an ounce of water. Okay, here you go. Have a good trip. You're like, that's not enough, right? I still got a lot of problems here, and I still got a problem here. I need food, and I need more water. Sound good? So, necessary assumptions tend to be very, very weak. And people like freak out about that. But you're like, yeah, it's not going to do a lot for the argument. But the real question is not, does this strengthen the argument? The real question is, do I absolutely need this if I want any chance of getting to the conclusion? Yeah.
For a necessary assumption question like this, for anything where we're trying to find where the gaps are, like where the flaws are between parts, does it make sense to diagram it?
I wouldn't diagram it. I would just, as you're reading, and you go from claim to claim, ask yourself, okay, does this claim follow logically from the one before it? And in a necessary assumption question, it's not uncommon to see 2 or 3 assumptions. By the time you're done with the argument, you're like, okay, well, it sucks for this reason, it sucks for that reason, it sucks for this reason, right? And then the necessary assumption answer that's correct is one of those assumptions, or maybe part of
Just
one of
as
those.
the minimum to like fix one.
Yeah, and you're like, okay, I fixed one, but the argument still sucks, right? Okay, in a sufficient assumption question, it turns out that you almost never, ever, ever have 2 flaws. Any guess why?
Because then that sufficient would have to bridge both flaws.
They'd have to bridge both of them. They're asking you, they're like, hey, please give me a sufficient assumption. Give me something that's enough to make this conclusion true. And you're like, okay, aye, I'm going to go do that. Well, if you have 2 holes in your argument, the correct answer would have to fix flaw 1 and flaw 2, which they certainly could do. They could write an answer choice that does that, right? They could write, hey, by the way, if you make money, then you're going to be happy. And by the way, if you're happy, then you're going to be generous. But that's a really long answer choice, and they're not inclined to write such long answer choices. So I don't think I've ever seen it, but it's very unlikely for there to be 2 flaws. Usually only 1. Yeah.
Is there ever a case in which a sufficient question restates a conclusion?
Yes. It's happened twice, as far as I know. In the, let's see, what are there? 4,500 logical reasoning questions that I've seen. It's happened twice. And in one case, they gave you the contrapositive of the conclusion. They said they completely ignored the premises. And everybody's like, what the, bad word. Why is that the answer? And it's like, well, if that's true, then the conclusion has to be true, right?
Yeah, I think I've done one of those 2.
Okay.
And I reviewed it like 15 times and was really annoyed because I was like, oh, it's not an assumption because it's already in the argument.
Yes. So it's really anything that, if it were true, would make the conclusion true. That's a sufficient assumption. Because if you took the conclusion, right? I mean, just a thought experiment here. If you took the conclusion and put it into the argument, because an assumption is a missing premise, right? So you're saying, okay, let's go ahead and put that into the argument. If you put that into the argument, then yeah, now because it's a premise, what do you have to do?
Assume true.
You have to assume that it's true. And if you assume that the conclusion is true, well, now you've just proven the conclusion. So it's the easiest way to do it, but that works. Are you all right?
Both the chicken and the egg came first, is what you're saying.
You have a lot of interesting analogies.
Very rural, apparently.
Well, I didn't say that, but sure, that's a chicken egg rural analogy. Okay, cool. But the bottom line is that in a sufficient assumption question, yes, to answer your question, it's rare, but the correct answer could just be a restatement of the conclusion or a contrapositive, which is their little subtle way of trying to hide it a little bit. But I don't think I've ever seen a sufficient assumption question where you had more than one flaw. The reason I'm telling you that is that in a sufficient assumption question, you absolutely 100% need to predict the answer. Like you read the argument and you're like, oh yeah, it sounds good. Probably will sound good because there's only one problem and it's often hidden, right? You're like, sounds like a good argument. Then they're like, which one line if true enables the conclusion to be properly drawn? You're like, oh, okay, sufficient assumption question. And at that moment in time, you need to go back and you need to find out where that jump is because they're going to have one jump, you find that jump, and now you know the answer. Because the answer is just going to connect the dots, right? You're like, okay, got it. And the wrong answer is going to connect it in the wrong way, right? Like in this argument, if we had only one flaw number 1, and we said, look, this guy made money, therefore he's going to be happy, we're going to look for an answer choice that says, if you make money, then you're going to be happy. And the wrong answers are going to say, any guess?
For necessary?
For sufficient.
For sufficient.
And both, really. So for necessary too. They're going to say, if you're happy, then you make money. Right? That's not going to do it. Because you have to go from the known to the unknown. So we got to take us from the premise to the intermediate conclusion. So you got to connect the dots and you got to figure out what the problem is. And then you go and you know the answer and you go find it. Okay? Now, there are some assumptions out there that are both necessary and sufficient at the same time. So to give you an example of that, let's just say that I said to you, hey, you know, that door is nicely crafted. It's crafted nicely. Sound good? Therefore, it is valuable. What do you guys think? How would you fix this argument?
Crafted doors are worth a lot of money.
Okay. Crafted doors are worth a lot of money. What do you guys think? Does that... Wait, no? Why not?
Then you have to connect, like, you're just assuming that something's worth a lot of money means that it's valuable.
Are you cool with that?
I will do this. John, give it to me. I will do it to you.
Yeah, so, I mean, just because something is worth a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean that it's valuable. It depends on what you value. Right? So, this is like getting us closer, but ultimately doesn't do it, right? Yes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I would expect to see would be things that are nicely crafted are valuable.
That's it. They're just gonna connect it, right? So things that are nicely crafted are valuable. Now this right here is a sufficient assumption because if this is true and we add it to this premise, you have these two premises, then this has to be true, right? This is also a necessary assumption because that is what this person is necessarily assuming. That's how they got to their conclusion. Now, let me give you an example of a sufficient assumption that's not necessary. Something like that could be that all things are valuable. If all things are valuable, right, then this thing that happens to be crafted nicely, that's great, is going to be valuable because it's a thing. Are you cool with that? So this is sufficient but not necessary because we don't need to make that assumption about everything. Right? Some things have value. That is a necessary assumption, but not a sufficient one, right? Because, oh, okay, great. Some things have value. Does this thing have value? I still don't know, right? But I have to assume that because if you don't assume that, what is true?
Nothing's
Nothing, including us, has value, right? And then, therefore, this conclusion cannot follow. So this is a necessary but not sufficient assumption. Sound good? All right. Now, I think one reason people get mixed up with necessary and sufficient assumption questions is that because maybe 40% of the time the correct answer is both necessary and sufficient, well, what happens? You get a necessary assumption question. For some reason, you get twisted around in your head and you start doing the sufficient assumption test. In other words, you start looking for something that's going to prove the conclusion. You find it. And you're like, yep. And the back of the book says, correct. And you're like, oh, good. I get these questions. Right? And then you get another one you get wrong. You're like, I hate these questions. Or you're doing a sufficient assumption question, and you're looking for something that's absolutely necessary, and you're like, oh yeah, that's necessary. This argument did assume this, and you get it correct, and you're like, sweet. So you have to know exactly what you're looking for, because on some occasions they can give you a correct answer that's both. Now, necessary assumption, the questions look like this. They say, which one of the following is an assumption that the argument depends on? Depends, right? Necessary. Which one of the following is an assumption the argument requires? Again, that means necessary. This one will say something quite different. It will say, which one of the following, if assumed? Notice that key language, if assumed. Not that it needs to be or is necessary, but if it were, enables the conclusion to be properly drawn. Yes?
So if it's just assumption, or it says assumes without the if, is it necessary?
That's right. So if there's no qualifier, if they just say the argument assumes which one of the following, they're referring to a necessary assumption.
Will there be any that says assumes and properly drawn?
They can say that, and you really want to focus on the word assumption, and are they asking you for one that's necessary or not? So they could say, which one of the following is the assumption that is needed in order for the conclusion to be properly drawn? You're looking for a necessary assumption, even though they say properly drawn. The question is, okay, well, what kind of assumption? Do you want one that's necessary, or do you want one that, if it were true, would enable the conclusion to be properly drawn? Yeah. Yes?
Is one way to think of it sort of in that vein, like an assumption that we could insert that would make things true versus an assumption they're already making that helps
That's
underpin
exactly
our-
right. So which one is which?
So like the one that we could make to fix things is sufficient, and the one they're already making is necessary.
That's right. Which assumption are you making right now? You have to be thinking this. You have to be agreeing with this, regardless of whether it proves your conclusion. Is a necessary assumption, and one where you can be Zeus and make whatever claim you want. Which one, if it were inserted into the argument, would prove it? That's a sufficient assumption. Not that it's necessary. Like, this is not necessary, right? All things are valuable. We didn't need to assume that. Like, if you made this argument, or if someone made this argument, and you walked it up to them and they're like, hey, you're assuming that all things are valuable. They'd be like, no, I'm not. Idiot, right? I'm just assuming that nicely crafted things are valuable, right? And they're like, okay, well you are assuming that. And so sufficient assumptions are not necessary, but necessary assumptions, like if you walked up to me and said, oh, you're assuming some things are valuable, I'd be like, yeah, I do think some things are valuable, because I just asserted that this thing is valuable, so I have to agree with that. Yeah. Okay, little shortcut here, can be abused, but in necessary assumptions, you almost never see the word if. Almost never. And in sufficient assumption questions, you almost always see the word if. And again, I don't want to create confusion here, but they're using if in part because they're using it in the same way that we call this a sufficient condition. They're saying, if assumed, which one is sufficient? Which one, if it were true, would make this conclusion true? Sound good? Okay, so here, which answer will prove the conclusion? Which answer do I have to accept as true? Which one will prove? Which one do I have to accept as true? Last thing I should say about necessary assumption questions, if you're debating between two answer choices, you can test them by negating them. Right? That's what we were doing here. If you negate this, if you say that, no, some things are not, there. If I say some things are valuable, the negation of that is nothing is valuable, right? Like, if you don't want this to be true anymore, you have to say nothing is valuable. You don't say some things are not valuable. That's consistent with this claim. I'm getting rid of this claim. If I say some things are valuable and I want to say, no, that's no longer true, then I have to say nothing is valuable. That's the negation of this. If the negation of the assumption destroys the conclusion, then it was necessary. If it doesn't destroy the conclusion, then it wasn't necessary. Right? Like here, if you negate this, if I say all things are valuable and you're like, no, that's not true, what does that mean? If all things are valuable and you negate that, what does that become?
Not all things are valuable.
Not all things are valuable. Some things aren't valuable. Does that mean that this thing isn't valuable? No, so the negation of this does not destroy the conclusion, but the negation of that destroys this conclusion. So that's one way to test necessary. Right? Do you need an ounce of water to get across the desert? Yes. If you don't have that ounce of water, maybe you could like fly really fast. But in any case, if you're like had to walk, right, for hundreds of miles, okay? You need that water. But just because you have it doesn't mean you're now good to go, but at the same time, if you don't have even an ounce, you're toast. That's the idea. Okay. Any other questions on necessary sufficient? Okay.